I wasn't in a good place that spring, and that is a cleaner sentence than the truth deserved. The truth was slower and pettier and harder to say out loud. I was 52, sleeping in my dead father's river house with a mattress that leaned left, eating standing up at the sink, and pretending my life had narrowed because I preferred it that way. In town, they still called me dependable, which sounded like praise until you understood what they meant. Dependable with concrete, steel, valves, culverts, gate chains. Dependable when anything leaked, cracked, froze, or jammed. Not dependable for birthdays, hard talks, apologies, or sitting still long enough to let another person tell me I'd hurt them. I had built a reputation sturdy enough to hide inside, and I had been hiding in it for years. The divorce papers arrived in a thick envelope with my name, typed straight and formal, like a job estimate. I read them at the kitchen table in the rental duplex I had then, signed where they flagged, and mailed them back before supper. No dramatic fight, no throwing things, no courtroom speeches, just paperwork and silence, which was my specialty. Marlene never begged, and I never asked for another shot. That was the part that stayed with me, not what we said, what we didn't. She had told me once, 2 years before it ended, "You don't yell, Clint. You just leave the room while I'm still in it." At the time, I told her I was avoiding a fight. Later, I understood I had been avoiding being known. My son, Eli, was 30 now and taught shop class at the high school down in Bracken Valley, 12 miles below the dam. He had my hands and his mother's patience, which made him better than me at almost every human thing that mattered. The last real conversation we'd had ended with him saying, very calm, "Dad, I don't need money or favors. I need you to answer your phone when I call." I said I was busy and tired of getting graded like a student. He went quiet, and then he said, 8 months then. Let's see if you notice." He wasn't shouting. That was worse. He was naming weather. After that, he kept his word and stopped calling. I kept mine and stayed stubborn. 8 months turned into a hard little knot I carried around like a stone in my chest. When my father died, the river place came to me because there was nobody else to give it to. 2 bedrooms, old cedar siding, sagging porch rail, and a tool shed that smelled like oil and wet rope no matter the season. I moved in, telling everybody it was practical, closer to the Mill Creek structure, cheaper than rent, good access to the service road. All that was true. The underlying truth was that no one expected me to explain myself out there. The house sat where fog rolled in low off the water and held to the grass until mid-morning, and some nights the only sound was current pushing against old pilings below the bend. It was lonely in a way that didn't ask questions. I liked that more than I should have. Boone came with the place more or less. He was my father's cattle dog, 14 and stiff in the hips with one torn ear and a slow, dignified trot that made every trip from porch to truck look like an official inspection. He slept by the wood stove and snored like a man sawing rough pine. He still came to work when I let him, mostly because he stared at me from the doorway until I gave in. I'd grumble at him on the drive up the service road, and he'd look out the cracked passenger window like the world was still full of assignments worth showing up for. Dogs have a way of making your routines look less noble and more obvious. Boone knew I was lonely long before I admitted it. Nobody wanted pre-dawn checks at Old Mill Creek, so I took them and told the crew I preferred mornings. The real reason was simpler. In the dark, before anybody had enough coffee to make small talk, a man could do his rounds and hear only what needed fixing. The shift had a script, and the script was mercy. Park at the east pullout. Thermos on the hood. Flashlight sweep on the walkway bolts. Walk the spillway lip and watch for fresh seep lines along the western abutment. Note, frost heave. Measure driftwood load against the trash rack. Log water elevation. Gate response lag. Concrete temperature at 2 points. Tighten what could be tightened. Flag what couldn't. By the time the town woke up, I had already spent 3 hours in a world where problems came with dimensions and torque values. My foreman title sounded bigger than my actual office, which was a dented desk in a cinder block room that shook when the old heater kicked in. The county paid me enough to keep the lights on and the truck running. In return, I gave it what I gave everything: consistency without intimacy. Garth from Nights would hand me the clipboard at shift change and say things like, "West's shoulder looked soft yesterday. Keep an eye on it." I'd say, "Got it." That was usually our whole exchange. One Tuesday, he lingered by the coffee machine, cap in his hands, and said, "Eli still teaching down valley?" I knew where the question was going and chose the shortest road around it. "Far as I know," I said. Garth nodded, then tried again. "Good kid. My nephew's in his class. Says he fixed a lathe the district was going to scrap." Sounds like him. He watched me for a second, then looked away toward the window. "You ought to go see that shop sometime." "Maybe." He gave a half smile that held no humor. "You say, maybe like it owes you money." I pretended to check the gauge board so I didn't have to answer that one. Garth didn't push. Most folks in our line learn where not to put weight. After shift, I stopped at Lila's Diner on Route 8 because they opened at 5 and asked no philosophical questions before sunrise. Lila poured coffee from a pot older than both of us and slid 2 eggs and wheat toast in front of me before I ordered. Habit can look like kindness when you're tired enough. She wiped the counter and said, "You look worse than yesterday, Clint." "That's efficiency," I said. "I'm streamlining." She snorted. "Streamline yourself into some sleep, then." "Working on it. You still pretending that place by the river isn't eating you alive?" I took a bite to buy time. "House is fine." "I asked about you." That was Lila. No meanness, no softness either. Just direct. I stared at the steam coming off my cup and gave her a shrug because I had practiced that move for decades. She shook her head, topped off my coffee anyway, and let me sit in peace. A small mercy. People think care arrives as big speeches. Most days it shows up as somebody not letting you lie without making a scene. At home, evenings stretched. I'd sit at the kitchen table with the one good lamp and a legal pad full of maintenance notes, tracing numbers I already knew. Seepage rates, projected inflow, thaw forecasts, weak points from the last inspection cycle. The thaw surge was coming early that year. Snowpack high in the ridges, daytime melt, nighttime refreeze, then 2 warm systems stacked back to back. Water with nowhere polite to go. Old earthen shoulders never loved spring, and Mill Creek's western side had been patched enough times to look like a stitched coat. County wanted full reinforcement next fiscal year. Water was not waiting for fiscal year. 3 nights in a row I picked up my phone, scrolled to Eli's name and set it back down. I'd start composing a text and delete it before the 3rd line. "Hey kid, sorry I've been..." "No. You busy this weekend?" "No, I saw the yearbook photo from your class project and..." "No." Every sentence sounded like I was applying for a permit instead of talking to my own son. On the 4th night, Boone climbed halfway into my lap, joints popping, and pinned me to the chair with his full, old dog weight. I scratched behind his ears and said to him, because saying it to a dog felt less dangerous, "I don't know how to do this right." He thumped his tail once against the chair leg like he had heard worse men say worse things and survive. By the 2nd week of March, my world had settled into a pattern that looked responsible from the outside and hollow from the inside. Wake at 3:30, coffee black, Boone at the truck door before I had my boots tied, service road up through fir and cedar, tires crunching frost in the ruts. Headlamp beam crossing bare branches, then concrete, then dark moving water under spillway lights. Check, log, tighten, note, repeat. Come back down with mud on my cuffs and numbers in my pocket and the same ache in my ribs where family should have been. I told myself duty was enough. I told myself men like me were built for utility, not closeness. I told myself if I kept the valley dry and the gates responsive, that counted as a life. Maybe it did, partly. But the truth was I had confused usefulness with connection and called it character. The morning everything started, I left the house before dawn with that same old script in my head, and not one clue that the world had plans larger than my stubbornness. The truck coughed once in the cold and then settled into that old diesel clatter. I trusted more than most people. Boone hauled himself into the passenger seat in 2 stages, front legs first, and then the hindquarters with a grunt that sounded offended at his own hips. I eased down the drive with my coffee wedged between my knees, headlights cutting a pale tunnel through low fog hanging over the river meadow. The road up to Mill Creek always felt longer in that hour before dawn, when the world hadn't committed to morning yet, and every fence post looked like a man waiting to be asked what you were doing with your life. I kept both hands on the wheel and let the same loop run in my head, the one I'd been wearing smooth for months. Call Eli. Don't call Eli. Say you're sorry. For what, exactly? For all of it. For none of it right. I had no shortage of facts, and no language for the part that mattered. Boone rested his chin on the door and watched the ditch lights slide by, calm as a preacher in an empty church. I envied him that. Dogs don't rehearse old arguments. They either come when called, or they don't. By 4:17, the tyres hit the first grated section of the service approach, and the sound changed from gravel hiss to metal hum. I parked at the east pullout, clicked off the engine, and let the sudden quiet settle around us. Usually there'd be some layered noise, even in dark hours. Creek chatter below the spillway, a few early blackbirds, wind touching the cottonwoods by the western shoulder. That morning, I noticed only my own movements, the snap of the thermos lid, Boone's collar tags, my boots scraping concrete. Routine took over because routine always did. Flashlight beam over anchor bolts and handrail welds. Spillway lip clear except for a knot of willow twigs. Gate 1 response lag normal. Gate 2 still a half-second lazy from last week's freeze, noted for grease. Concrete temp at the upstream marker 2 degrees warmer than predicted, which fit the early melt pattern, and made me mutter a wordless complaint at the ridgeline snowpack I couldn't see yet. Work was good that way. Work didn't ask me to explain who I was becoming when no one was looking. On the western abutment, I knelt and ran my fingers along yesterday's damp line. Still there, maybe a shade wider, but not enough to trigger a crew at that hour. The earth smelled rich and cold, wet clay under frost crust, the smell of pressure looking for roots. I understood that smell. I had spent half my life reading where water wanted to go and talking it into going elsewhere with rock, steel, and stubbornness. It struck me, standing there with my lamp low and Boone breathing beside me, that I had never tried half that hard in my own house. I sat on the inspection platform to write my notes, elbows on my knees, pencil moving across the waterproof pad in block letters my father would have called too neat for fieldwork. Seep west, shoulder, monitor. Gate 2, lag stable. Trash rack, 12%, load. I stared at the page after I finished, as if another line might appear if I waited. There was a weight behind my ribs I could usually ignore when my hands were busy. In still moments it came forward. Not sharp pain, not drama, just a dull, pressing grief for all the conversations I'd postponed, until they turned into history. Don't start, I told myself out loud, and Boone lifted his head like I had addressed him. He nudged my forearm with a cold nose. I scratched behind his ear and laughed once under my breath. You and me, partner. Two experts in avoiding direct communication. He thumped his tail against the concrete twice, forgiving me for being late to a joke he'd known for years. I pulled out my phone then, mostly to prove to myself I could do one brave thing before sunrise. Eli's name sat near the top, unchanged. That same picture from 2 summers back, with him in a welding hood, pushed up on his head, grinning like he'd just solved a problem that had made other men swear. My thumb hovered over call. I could hear the first sentence in my mind and hated it. Hey kid, it's early, I know. No. Eli, I've been stubborn and that's not your fault. Better, but thin. I locked the screen and shoved the phone back in my jacket before I could fail in one more specific way. When I stood again, Boone was no longer beside me. He had walked 10 yards down the platform and was sitting perfectly still, facing the tree line above the access path. Not rigid, not alarmed, just attentive, ears lifted, tail sweeping slow arcs across the damp surface like he was greeting somebody, taking their time, coming up a porch step. Boone barked at delivery trucks, squirrels, and one memorable snowman someone put by the highway turnout. For him to sit there quiet and wag at empty timber was strange enough that I stopped in place and listened. That was when I noticed the birds. I noticed them by their absence. No robin chatter in the brush, no chickadee fuss from the cedar snag, no wing rustle from the reeds below the retaining wall. The whole slope held a deep, settled hush that didn't feel dead, just intent, like the forest had paused to watch something careful happen. I told myself cold snaps can mute morning calls. I told myself I was overtired and primed to turn ordinary quiet into significance. Evidence suggested those explanations should have been enough. They weren't. I stepped toward Boone and my beam washed across the inspection platform where spray usually left everything slick. 3 flat riverstones sat stacked near the center seam, largest on bottom, then a medium grey one, then a thin tan oval on top, balanced so clean it looked deliberate in a way nature rarely bothers with. They were wet, but not from random splash. The upper surfaces gleamed while the undersides looked freshly turned, darker where they'd been lifted from colder ground. That stack had not been there 40 minutes earlier when I logged the bolts. I crouched beside it and held my hand near without touching, like I was inspecting a weld I didn't trust. The stones were the kind you found along the low bend 2 miles downriver, smoothed by long current, easy to palm if you were patient. Kids could have done it. Maybe if kids were climbing restricted dam structures before dawn to make tiny sculptures in freezing spray. Pranksters, then. Except pranksters usually leave initials, spray paint, beer cans, something that says, "Look at me." This looked like work set out for someone else. Boone gave a soft huff and kept wagging toward the trees. "You know something I don't?" I asked him. He stood, took 3 slow steps toward the cedar at the edge of the maintenance path, and sat again. Same posture, same calm expectation. He didn't glance back at me once, which for an old dog with a strong union contract about staying near the truck was unusual on its own. I swept my light along the timberline. Fern, cedar trunk, last year's leaf litter, a run of blackberry canes bent under frost. No eyeshine, no movement, no sound except water pressing low against concrete and my own jacket creaking when I breathed. I walked to the cedar and scanned the ground. Mud showed tracks from my boots, Boone's pads, and an older set of deer prints heading downslope. Nothing else clear enough to swear by. A branch at shoulder height had been bent inward, not broken, as if something broad had passed slowly and chose not to force it. I touched the bend point. The wood was fresh and damp. Could have been wind, could have been weight, could have been me needing a story to pin this morning on, so I wouldn't have to think about my own failings for 5 straight minutes. I stood there longer than I meant to. Lamp off now, letting the low pre-dawn light come up by degrees. Mist moved between fir trunks in pale sheets. The concrete under my boots held night cold through the soles. Somewhere downstream, a single duck gave one short call, then quiet again. Boone stayed seated by the cedar like a patient host. I told myself this couldn't mean anything. I told myself I was a county foreman, not a man who read omens in rocks. I told myself all that, and still I lifted the top stone and set it back with care, because it felt rude not to. For reasons I didn't fully understand, I logged it. At 5:02, under notes, I wrote, 3 flat stones stacked on west platform. Possible trespass, no damage observed. Dog alert /calm at tree line. I stared at that last phrase. Dog alert /calm. Then left it. If anybody read it later, they'd roll their eyes and call me tired. Fine. I'd been called worse by people who loved me. On the walk back to the truck, Boone stayed close but kept turning his head toward the trees, ears lifting every few steps. Not worried, interested. I tried once more to force a plain explanation onto the morning and came up with 3 weak ones and 1 strong fact. Something had happened on my dam while I was 10 yards away writing numbers, and my old dog had behaved like he was in the company of a familiar neighbor. I sat in the driver's seat with the door open, watching dawn thin the fog above the water. My hands were cold despite gloves. The knot in my chest, the one named Eli and divorce papers, and years of saying maybe when I meant yes, had eased by a notch I hadn't earned. Curiosity had pushed grief off center for the first time in months. That unsettled me more than the stones did. "Don't get weird," I said to Boone as I started the engine. He sneezed, then put his chin back on the door and watched the tree line until we turned the bend and lost sight of it. By the time we hit Route 8, dawn had started to thin the sky over the ridge, and I realized I had made the whole drive without rehearsing what I'd say to Eli if I called him. For 8 months, that argument had run like static under every task. That morning, my mind kept circling 3 wet stones on concrete, and Boone wagging at empty timber like he was waiting for somebody polite. I stopped at Lila's because habit still had me by the sleeve. She took one look at me through the pass-through and said, "You look like you saw your taxes early." "Worse," I said, peeling off gloves. I found decorative landscaping on county infrastructure. She leaned on the counter, coffee pot in hand. "You saying somebody planted petunias on the spillway?" "Stacked rocks, 3 of them, neat as a church table, on the west platform." "That all?" And Boone sat there, wagging at the trees like an old friend was running late. Lila poured, then slid my cup over. "Could be kids. At 5 in the morning. Could be one weird kid then." I gave a tired smile. That explanation should make me feel better. It doesn't. She watched me for a beat, then said, quieter, "You've had your head underwater for a long time, Clint. Maybe you noticed something because you finally looked up." I opened my mouth to argue and shut it again. She set eggs in front of me and moved on to another customer. That was the whole kindness. No sermon. Just enough truth to make me chew slowly. At the cinderblock office, I filed the log and circled the trespass note so I couldn't pretend later I hadn't written it. Garth came in with wet cuffs and his lunch pail, cap pushed back on his head. "What did you mark in red?" he asked, peering over my shoulder. "Possible trespass on West Platform. Nothing damaged." He read the line, snorted once. "Dog alert /calm. What's that mean?" "It means he noticed something and didn't care to bark." Garth scratched his jaw. "Boone ever wrong about folks?" "Not often." Then I'd check for snares. Guys poaching rabbits up there again, maybe. They move quiet, dogs smell 'em, birds go hush. That was practical enough to hold on to, so I held on to it. I'll sweep the slope tomorrow, he nodded. Do that, and maybe sleep a little. You got that look. Everybody kept saying that, and none of them were wrong. I went home, fed Boone, and sat on the porch with my boots still on, listening to the river shove past last year's driftwood. Usually that hour felt like a waiting room I couldn't leave. I'd stare at my phone, pick it up, put it down, run through old conversations until I was mad at ghosts. That day I found myself sketching the west shoulder on the back of an envelope instead, marking where the damp line had widened since Monday. The thaw surge forecast was pinned to my fridge with a rusted magnet. Warm rain above snowline by Friday. Sustained inflow through the weekend. Water would test every weak place we had. By late afternoon, I drove back up in full light, mostly to prove to myself there was a simple explanation. Mill Creek looked smaller in daylight, less haunted by imagination. Rust streaks on the handrails. Hairline cracks where I already knew they were. Crows heckling from the cottonwoods like unpaid inspectors. Boone trotted ahead of me to the same cedar and sat down again, tail brushing dead needles in slow sweeps. I followed the edge of the path and found what Garth had guessed. A wire snare staked low between two saplings. Loop sprung, stake pulled halfway free. No rabbit in it, no fur caught in the twist. The wire had been unwound and bent back so cleanly it looked done by pliers. Except there were no plier marks, just a patient spiral and one broad smear of mud on the sapling bark, at about my chest height. I stood there, squinting at it, feeling foolish for how hard my heart was beating over a piece of wire. Poacher got interrupted, I muttered, because saying anything else sounded like I had gone soft in the head. Boone sniffed the open loop, then looked back toward the cedar instead of the trail. He was calm, interested, not one hair up along his spine. I pulled the snare stake, coiled the wire, and dropped both into the bed toolbox. Physical evidence, handled. If a game warden asked, I could hand it over and keep my dignity intact. I took photos with my phone, stake hole, bent loop, mud smear, and emailed them to my county address before I forgot. That way it was logged, time-stamped, boring as paperwork. At supper I called dispatch and reported, removed illegal snare near restricted dam property. No active suspect observed. The woman on duty, Marcy, said she'd forward it to Wildlife Patrol in the morning and thanked me for logging coordinates. External contact made, outcome pending, nothing dramatic. I slept heavier that night than I had in weeks, not because I felt safe exactly, but because curiosity had finally outvoted regret for a few hours. 3 days passed before I heard back from Wildlife Patrol, and by then the pattern had gotten harder to dismiss. Wednesday morning the hush came again before dawn. Same deep quiet over the western slope. Same odd sense that the forest wasn't empty, just occupied. The snare spot was clear except for my own boot prints from the day before and one fresh track in damp soil that looked wrong for deer. Too long through the midfoot, edges softened by seep water. I knelt with my tape and still couldn't make it fit anything I trusted. Boone sat beside me, tail tapping my shin, patient as ever. On the platform, 5 fist-sized river stones were lined up near the damp seam, not stacked this time, arranged by size like somebody had laid out parts before starting repair. I laughed under my breath, embarrassed at myself. What kind of grown man says excuse me to a mystery pile of rocks? I murmured, stepping around them instead of through. Boone glanced up at me with that old dog expression that made me feel like the junior partner. By Thursday, the wet seam below the western abutment had become a narrow runnel, thin but persistent. water finding daylight through clay that should have held another month. I measured flow with a bucket and stopwatch, logged the numbers twice, then radioed Garth to put a weekend crew on standby for bags and riprap. He said, "Copy. County'll hate the overtime and love not flooding." That line landed heavier than he meant it to. All through those mornings, I kept expecting my mind to settle, for the odd details to sort themselves into one decent explanation. Teenagers, poachers, sleep deprivation, some combination of all three. Instead, the details began linking arms. The birds went quiet only on that stretch near the cedar. Boone refused to bark there, though he'd still bark at my truck door if I took too long with the keys. The stones kept appearing where the seam looked weakest, never anywhere random. And every time I stepped onto the west platform, I felt less alone and less afraid than I had any right to feel. I stood there Thursday with the mist lifting off the spillway, and had one of those private arguments I used to think were for other men. I told myself this couldn't be real, that grown people with pensions and blood pressure medication do not stumble into stories told behind bait shop counters. I told myself I wanted facts, not wonder, because wonder asked more of me than bolts and gate chains ever had. But another part of me, the part I had kept under concrete for years, kept saying, "Stay still and look. Just look." Friday came warm and wet, the first true thaw morning, and the service roads sweated mud under my tyres. I parked early, 4:06 by the dash clock, and left the engine off long enough to hear water pressing against the upstream face with a heavier note than earlier in the week. Boone jumped down slower than usual, but with purpose, headed straight for the cedar, and waited. I didn't use my flashlight at first. The moon was thin, but the cloud deck held enough reflected light to paint shapes in silver grey. I moved along the handrail, boots careful on slick concrete, and stopped when I heard something below the platform. Not a crash, not brush breaking. A steady, soft sound of weight, meeting mud, then lifting, then setting again. Deliberate, unhurried. I crouched and looked over the edge toward the shallow backwater where runoff pooled before joining the channel. At first I saw only mist and the pale cuts of current around exposed rock. Then a darker form separated from the cedar shadows 20 yards out, too tall by half for any man I knew, broad through the shoulders, fur catching the low light in dull brown-black bands. It was kneeling near the runnel, one long arm extended, placing a stone into the waterline with 2 fingers, and a thumb so gently there was barely a ripple. My breath stopped so hard it hurt. The figure reached behind, took another stone from a small pile on the bank, and set it into the seep with the same care, as if it were fitting pieces in a place it understood better than I did. No thrashing, no display, no hurry. Just work. Practical, exact work. I shifted my weight, and a dead branch under my boot gave a dry snap. The figure paused and turned its head toward me. Even in that low light, I could see the face was not bare, not any elk shadow trick, not a man in a coat. The brow was heavy, the nose broad and flat, the eyes set deep and catching what little light there was in a warm amber brown that held steady without hardening. It stayed kneeling. It did not advance. It simply watched me and waited, giving me room to decide what I would do next. Every sensible part of my brain shouted to back away slow. Get in the truck, call somebody with a badge and a tranquilizer and an opinion. But Boone walked forward 3 steps, sat down at my knee and wagged once, twice, calm as sunrise. I felt ridiculous and strangely formal all at once. A man in wet boots interrupting a stranger's chore. "Sorry," I whispered into the mist. Didn't mean to step loud. Saying that to a 9-foot unknown should have earned me a medal for poor crisis instincts. Instead, It felt like the truest thing I'd said all month. The creature held my gaze another second, then turned back to the seam and resumed placing stones, each movement deliberate, each placement followed by a brief press of its palm to settle mud around the edges. I stayed where I was, hands open at my sides so I wouldn't spook what already knew I was there. Water moved, mist drifted. Boone's tail brushed my pant leg in a steady rhythm that kept me anchored. I watched for what might have been 5 minutes or 50. Clock time didn't mean much in that moment. I watched scale and gentleness occupy the same body without contradiction. I watched something I had no framework for repair work I recognized down to the wrist angle. And while I watched, the old knot in my chest loosened another turn, not solved, not healed, but moved. Curiosity had already pushed grief aside for a morning. Now, wonder stood in the same place, quiet and undeniable. When the small pile of stones was gone, the creature pressed the last one into the seep, sat back on its heels, and looked up at me once more. No challenge in it, no plea either, just acknowledgement, like two workers checking each other's line before dawn. Then it rose in one smooth motion, stepped backward toward the firs, and faded into shadow so gradually I could not point to the exact second it disappeared. I stayed on the platform until first light touched the top cables, breathing cold air that smelled of wet clay and cedar bark. Boone leaning against my shin as if this had all gone according to plan. I stayed there until the light turned the spillway cables from black to dull silver, and the practical part of my brain finally elbowed forward hard enough to make me move. I climbed down to the shallow backwater where I had watched him kneel. The stones were seated tight along the runnel lip, each one braced with thumb-sized wedges and pressed into clay at an angle that slowed flow instead of fighting it head-on. It was good work. Not lucky work, not random, not a pile kicked in by runoff. Good work done by somebody who understood what water did when it got patient. Boone stepped beside me, sniffed once, and then just stood there with his shoulder against my knee, calm and warm and solid. I crouched until my knees complained and studied every placement like I was checking a trainee's first patch. There were marks in the mud where broad fingers had smoothed seams closed, then feathered the edges so pressure spread out instead of punching through one weak point. I had done that same motion 1,000 times with gloves on. Seeing it there, scaled up and cleaner than my own, knocked the air out of me in a quieter way than fear ever had. I told myself this couldn't be real. I told myself there had to be a human explanation I could carry into a county meeting without sounding unwell. But the evidence sat under my hand, damp and exact, and none of my old explanations fit. When I finally stood, my legs felt unreliable, like I'd climbed off a ladder that was still swaying. I logged the seep rate again. Lower than yesterday. Not solved, but slower by enough to matter. I wrote the number twice to make sure I hadn't transposed it, then added one line I knew I would regret if I had to defend it later. Stone pack added overnight. Improved flow control. Source unknown. Boone sneezed and looked toward the firs as if he expected someone to step back out for a quality check. Nobody did. At the truck, I keyed the radio and called Garth. "You up?" I asked. "Regrettably," he said, voice thick with early hour. "What broke?" "Nothing broke. West Seep dropped about 20% since yesterday. Somebody added rock at the toe and dressed mud around it. There was a pause long enough for static to fill the gap. Somebody as in county crew? No sign-in, no truck tracks. Works clean though. You're telling me trespassers did competent maintenance before dawn?" "That is exactly what I'm telling you, and I hear it too." He let out a low breath that could have been a laugh or concern. Take photos, send measurements. We'll call it undocumented field stabilization till we know better. Copy. And Clint? Yeah. You sound like you're trying not to shake. I looked at my hand on the mic and saw he was right. Cold morning, I said. Uh-huh, he answered and left me that out. By the time I reached Lila's, my coffee had gone lukewarm in the thermos and my head felt overfull, like a toolbox somebody had shaken shut. I sat at the counter and stared at the sugar caddy until she set a fresh mug down in front of me. You look worse than taxes today, she said. I rubbed both hands over my face. You ever apologize to a stranger for stepping on a stick? Depends on the stranger. I gave a short laugh that surprised me. What if the stranger is about 9 feet tall and better at erosion control than county staff? Lila stopped wiping the counter. Her eyes stayed on mine long enough that I nearly took it back. Then she said, very plain, "You making fun of yourself or telling me true?" I don't know how to answer that without sounding like I need medical supervision. Try anyway. So I did. Not every detail, but enough. Stones, quiet, Boone calm as church. Something large working the seep and waiting when I moved. I left out the eyes because that part still felt private, even in my own head. Lila listened without interrupting, then poured me more coffee I hadn't asked for. You're not a dramatic man, she said. You're barely a conversational one. If you say you saw what you saw, I believe you saw it. That's not the same as believing what it was. No, she said, but it's a start. I carried that line with me the rest of the day. By Saturday morning, warm rain had chewed through half the ridge snow and the dam had started talking in deeper notes. Water hit the upstream face with a heavy, steady shove I felt through my boots before I saw the numbers. Boone and I did the walk in dim light and found another set of stones staged along the west path, this time sorted in 3 clusters by size, like a supply yard laid out by someone who hated wasted motion. Beside them sat 2 clay-rich lumps scraped clean of roots, exactly what I would have asked a labourer to bring if I'd had one with me. I stood there with my clipboard under my arm and laughed once into the rain. Either I'm losing my grip, I said to Boone, or I've got the most considerate anonymous helper in county history. He wagged like he approved both options. The Wildlife Patrol callback came at 10:14, while I was in the cinder block office drying my socks on the heater grate. Officer Mendez said they logged my snare report, picked up the wire from the evidence bin, and would increase passes near the upper trailheads. Probably opportunistic poaching, he said. Thanks for documenting it. No prints worth anything, I told him. Just the twisted wire. We'll note it. You see fresh hardware, call direct. I will. External contact resolved, paperwork tidy, world still pretending to be ordinary. I hung up and stared at the wall map of Mill Creek longer than needed. That afternoon, I drove back up off schedule with a shovel, 2 empty feed sacks, and a truck bed full of small riprap. If this was real, I could at least meet it halfway. If it wasn't, I still had a seep to manage. I parked, unloaded, and worked the west shoulder for an hour under light drizzle, packing where I could, marking where I couldn't, talking to Boone now and then because silence had started to feel less empty than before. Halfway through, he lifted his head toward the cedar and gave one soft woof. I turned and saw him standing at the tree line. Full daylight, no fog to hide behind. He was farther back than before, maybe 30 yards into the fir shadow, broad enough that the trunk beside him looked like a fence post. Dark fur lay wet along his arms and chest, heavy and coarse, not matted, just rain-darkened. He held still, hands low and open, head tilted slightly as if to keep me in view without crowding me. A mule deer doe stepped out 10 feet from him, browsed new shoots, and never spooked. Boone stayed at my side and wagged, slow and easy. The whole scene landed in me with a strange, calm certainty. If he had wanted me gone, I would have known by now. He wasn't afraid of me, and he wasn't trying to make me afraid of him. I set the shovel down where he could see both my hands, then nodded once like I was greeting a neighbor at the feed store. "Morning," I said, because apparently I had no better script. "West Side's giving me trouble." He watched me, then looked toward the seep and back, a small movement, but clear enough to read. "Work first." I swallowed, felt foolish again, and nodded like we had agreed on something formal. "I'm on it," I said. I went back to packing mud around the stones. He stayed where he was for several minutes, then moved through the trees in a wide arc that kept distance between us. The way he walked was what undid the last of my disbelief. No crashing, no swagger, no claim. He stepped over windfall and around saplings with deliberate care, placing each foot like weight was something to account for, not throw around. Once he paused beside a young cedar bent under a fallen limb, lifted the limb clear with one hand, and set it down without tearing branches. Then he was gone upslope, quiet as rain on needles. 2 mornings later, right before the week's first major surge, I learned what unmistakable kindness looked like when it wore size like that. I rolled in at 3:58 under a low cloud ceiling and heard the problem before I reached the platform. The trash rack at the intake had caught a fresh load of drift. Limbs, bark slabs, one thick cottonwood trunk spinning crosswise and forcing water to boil against the bars. If it locked in place, upstream pressure would jump fast and push more strain onto the west shoulder we were already nursing. I grabbed the pike pole from the truck and ran down, boots slipping on wet concrete. Boone came with me, then stopped short near the cedar and sat, alert but untroubled. I hooked the nearest limb and hauled. It moved an inch and jammed tighter. I reset, pulled again, felt my shoulder protest and got nowhere worth counting. Water shoved, relentless and indifferent, and for the first time that week, I felt true panic rise in my throat. Not for me, for the valley below, for porch lights and school buses and Eli's shop class opening up at 8, like any normal day. Then, from the left bank, he stepped into the spillway glow. He didn't rush. He came down the riprap slope with the same deliberate balance I had seen in the trees, stopped 10 feet from the rack, and looked to me first, waiting. I backed one step and lowered the pole to show clear space. He moved in, braced one hand on the concrete edge, and reached into the churning tangle. Fingers closed around the cottonwood trunk near its fork. He lifted, not with a jerk, but with steady pressure that rolled the log free of the bars, and swung it aside into calmer, eddy water, where it drifted clear. The boil at the rack eased at once. I stood there, drenched, useless pike pole in my hands, watching him clear limb after limb with precise motions that avoided the gate chains and sensor arm like he had studied the mechanism for years. Twice I pointed at snag points, and he followed the line of my arm, adjusted, and pulled exactly where load would release cleanest. Wordless coordination, practical as any 2-man crew I'd ever run. Boone sat 3 yards back, tail tapping concrete in slow beats. In less than 4 minutes, the rack was open enough for flow to smooth out. The upstream level mark dropped a fraction. Small number, huge relief. He stepped back from the water and turned towards the west shoulder. For a second, I thought he was leaving. Instead, he crossed to the staged stone piles, took one in each hand, and set them beside the seep in the order I usually used: base, brace, cap, then added a third, flatter piece over the weak lip where yesterday's mud had started to peel. It was not random help. It was directed at the exact point that kept me awake at night. My throat tightened so fast I had to look down. "Thank you," I said, voice rough and small under all that water noise. "You just bought us time." He stood still, rain beading along his brow ridge, and met my eyes. Steady amber brown, patient, no demand in it. Then he looked past me toward the valley lights barely visible through low cloud, as if checking the same thing I was checking. Home, people sleeping, a town trusting concrete and earth to hold till morning. He turned back to me once, gave the slightest dip of his head, and walked upslope toward the firs. No drama, no backward glance. Within 20 steps he was shadow and rain again. I stayed at the rack with both hands on the pike pole until my breathing settled. Boone pressed against my leg and leaned his weight there, old and faithful. The gauge light blinked green. Water kept moving where it was supposed to move. When I finally keyed the radio, my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Control, this is Caldwell at Mill Creek. Intake obstruction cleared. West seep temporarily stabilized with additional stone. Recommend first light crew for reinforcement." Dispatch answered. "Copy, Caldwell. Crew notified. ETA after 0600. I looked toward the cedar line one more time and saw only rain combing through branches. The work stood in front of me anyway. Open rack, slowed seep, stones placed by hands big enough to lift a log like kindling, and gentle enough to set a capstone without breaking the mud seal. Disbelief didn't vanish all at once. It gave ground, piece by piece, to what I could measure, touch, and no longer deny. I clipped the radio back to my vest and stood there in the rain with water hissing through the rack, trying to steady my hands by naming ordinary things. Pike pole, chain hoist, gauge light, west seam. If I could keep it in nouns and numbers, maybe my pulse would follow. It didn't. A new sound rolled up from the abutment, low and throaty, like someone dragging gravel through a steel drum. I knew that sound. Any damn hand knows it. Subsurface flow, finding speed. I ran for the west shoulder, boots sliding on the slick path, Boone pacing me with that stiff old dog lope that still covered ground when it counted. My headlamp bounced over the patch we had built the last few mornings. For one breath, it looked intact. Then I saw the change. A finger-wide cut had opened at the lower edge. Brown water punching out in hard bursts, carrying silt and pea gravel. Not seepage now. A live channel. I dropped to my knees in mud and jammed both gloved hands against the opening. Useless gesture, pure reflex. Water shoved past my palms with steady pressure that felt almost calm, which was the terrifying part. Chaotic failures you can read. Calm pressure just keeps taking what it wants. "Not tonight," I said through my teeth. "You don't get tonight." Boone stood beside me, rain running off his muzzle, eyes fixed on the cedar line instead of the leak, tail still. Not scared. Waiting. I forced myself up, grabbed the radio, and keyed dispatch again. "Control, Caldwell at West Abutment. Upgrading status. I have active piping at the shoulder. Repeat, active piping. Need immediate authorization to crack auxiliary gate 3 by 10% to reduce head. Confirm." Static. Then Marcy's voice sharpened fast. "Caldwell, copy active piping. Stand by." 3 seconds, 5. "Authorization granted, gate 3 to 10%. Document time and level change. Crew is en route. ETA 40 minutes, maybe less if roads hold." "Copy, gate 3 to 10. Tell them bring clay bags, riprap, and 2 portable floods." "Already on it." "You alone up there?" I looked at Boone, then toward the trees where rain moved like grey curtains. "No," I said before I could edit myself. "I've got help." She hesitated, then answered like a pro. "Copy, Caldwell. Keep talking to me every 5. I sprinted to the control pedestal, punched in the sequence with wet fingers, and heard the auxiliary gate motor wake with a groan that rattled through concrete. The indicator crawled from 0 to 3, then 6, then 10. Downstream, the release channel thickened, and the upstream mark began a slow drop. helpful, but not enough. The blowout at the shoulder kept coughing muddy water. By 4:41, rain had eased to a fine, cold mist, and every surface around me shone dull silver in the spillway lights. I hauled 2 sacks of clay from the truck bed, shouldered one, dragged one, and stumbled back to the breach. I slit the first bag and shoved clay into the cut, tamped it with my forearm, laid 3 stones over it. The channel bit under the edge and peeled the whole thing loose in less than 20 seconds. Second bag lasted maybe 30. I swore once, quiet and tired, not angry at the water so much as at my own smallness in front of it. Then, Boone gave one short huff and stepped aside, making room on the path. He came out of the fir shadow in full spillway light, close enough that I could see individual wet guard hairs along his shoulders and the steam of his breath in the cold. He was larger than my brain ever wanted to accept, but the first thing I registered was not size. It was composure. He approached the breach with the same workman focus I'd seen at the rack, glanced at me once, then at the channel, then at the staged stone clusters like he was checking inventory. I moved back 2 paces and pointed to the undercut lip where the flow was eating fastest. "There," I said, my voice thin in all that water noise. "Base first, then clay." He dropped to one knee beside the opening. The ground settled under his weight with a muted thud. He scooped thick mud from the bank with both hands, packed it deep into the cut, then pressed flat stones into the face at opposing angles, building a keyed wedge instead of a plug. I recognized the method immediately. Not blocking pressure outright, redirecting and diffusing it. He worked in layered pushes, mud, stone, mud, brace, each placement deliberate, each press held for 1 full second before release. I grabbed what he reached for next without being asked. Clay lumps, flat caps, smaller chalk stones. We fell into rhythm so naturally it startled me. I fed materials into his left reach while he packed with his right. When he shifted up the seam, I moved with him and tamped edges with my palms. At one point, he paused and touched 2 fingers to a spot 6 inches upslope, indicating a soft pocket I had missed. I dug there and found water threading under the surface, ready to daylight. He had seen it by the way the mud trembled. In that wet grey hour, kneeling shoulder to shoulder with something I had no category for, my mind finally stopped arguing with itself and just told the truth. I told myself this couldn't be real, and the words had no weight left. I wanted to run through every safe explanation, every polite lie a man could hand to a county board, but my hands were in the same mud as his, and the seam was slowing under our work. I knew somehow that I wasn't in danger. I knew I had been in danger for years in quieter ways, sealed off, narrowed down to tasks and torque values until I could fix gates better than I could return a call from my own son. Right there, with cold water soaking my knees and Boone steady at my back, something in me gave way that should have given way a long time ago. I wasn't being judged. I wasn't being measured. I was being met. The channel dropped from a hard spit to a thick gurgle. We added 1 more layer, then another. He pressed a broad palm over the center seam and held it while I shoved chocks along the lower edge. I could feel vibration through the mud, then less vibration, then almost sun. Water still moved where water always moved, but the breach had stopped speaking in that hungry gravel voice. It settled into silence. At 5:03, the first porch light blinked on down in Bracken Valley, a tiny amber square through mist and rain. I saw it over his shoulder, and that was when I broke. I sat back on my heels, mud to my elbows, and cried with no control and no dignity. The kind of crying that comes from a locked room finally opening. Not fear, relief so deep it hurt. Relief for the valley below us, for the school roof and the feed store, and Lila unlocking her diner door in an hour. Relief that Eli would walk into his shop class this morning and not hear sirens first. Relief that the world could still hold something vast and careful in the same body. Boone leaned against me and licked rain off my wrist, like that solved anything. Maybe it did. I wiped my face with a muddy sleeve and laughed once at myself, breath hitching. "You're seeing this, old man," I said to Boone. "You're absolutely seeing this." When I looked up, he was watching me, eyes steady, amber brown in the spillway glow. No triumph in them, no pity, just a patient attention that felt older than speech. He reached to the side, picked up one last smooth stone, and set it at the top of the patch where the seam had first opened, centered and firm, a capstone and a marker, all at once. Then he flattened his hand over it, gentle as a man smoothing a child's cowlick before school. I managed one word. "Thanks." He rose in a single controlled motion, mud sliding off his forearms. For a moment he stood above the repaired shoulder and turned his head toward the valley again, as if listening to distant houses wake. Then he stepped backward off the work area, giving the patch space, and moved toward the cedar line. He didn't hurry. He didn't look back for permission or praise. He walked the edge of the path to avoid soft ground, stepped over Boone without crowding him, and passed into fir shadow where mist and first light were starting to braid together. Within 10 strides he was a dark shape between trunks. Within 20 he was only movement in branches. Then there was nothing to point at, just the quiet forest and rain ticking on needles. I stayed kneeling by the patch until Marcy's voice crackled through the radio and pulled me back. "Caldwell, status check." I swallowed, keyed up. Breach flow reduced to 0 visible discharge. Repeat, 0 visible discharge at west shoulder after manual stabilization and gate reduction. Holding for crew verification. "Copy 0 visible discharge," she said, brisk and relieved. "County truck is 5 minutes out. You okay up there?" I looked at the capstone, then at Boone, then at the tree line now lit pale blue by morning. "Yeah," I said. "I'm okay." Headlights climbed the service road at 5:17, twin beams bouncing through drizzle. Garth jumped down before the truck fully stopped. 2 laborers right behind him with bagged clay and tools. He took one look at the shoulder, then at me, covered in mud and tears I hadn't fully wiped away. "What happened?" he asked. I handed him my log pad with shaking fingers. "Active piping at 4:32. Opened auxiliary gate to 10. Emergency hand pack at breach." It held. He scanned the patch, crouched, pressed the edge with his thumb and whistled low. "That is cleaner than most weekday work with a full crew." "Yeah," I said, voice rough again. "I had good help." He looked up, read something on my face, and chose not to press. "All right, we reinforce now while it's stable. You stay on numbers." External contact resolved. Crew on site. Bags in place. Riprap staged. The world sliding back into procedures and forms. While they worked, I stood 1 minute longer at the cedar line with Boone at my leg and watched morning open over the valley. No shape moved in the trees. No sign asked to be chased. He had done what he came to do and left without ceremony, and the silence he left behind felt less like absence than a hand on my shoulder, steady and kind. Then I turned back to the shoulder and went to work with the men I could explain on paper. Garth put me on gauge checks while he and the labourers built a proper buttress over the emergency patch. Clay bags first, then riprap keyed into the slope, then a temporary geotextile wrap until the county haul truck could bring better fill. We moved fast and quiet, boots sinking at the edge, shovels ringing against stone, everyone watching the seep line for any sign of renewed discharge. It stayed dry. At 6:12, I logged upstream level down 3 inches from peak and holding. At 6:40, the first county engineer truck arrived with Amber Kell from District Water Control, hard hat over a braid, tablet already open before she stepped out. She crouched beside the repair, ran gloved fingers over the face, and frowned in that focused way competent people do when something doesn't fit their expectation. "Who packed this initial seal?" she asked. "I did first response," I said. "True, but partial." Then crew reinforcement. She measured angles with a folding ruler and shook her head once. "Initial keying is unusually good for solo emergency work in low light." Garth glanced at me, the same loaded look from earlier, then looked back at Amber. "He undersells himself." I didn't answer. I kept writing numbers. By 8:05, we had a full temporary stabilization in place and a plan for permanent shoulder reconstruction filed to county. Amber dictated notes while I read timestamps from my pad. When she got to cause assessment, she said, "Probable thaw-driven piping event mitigated by unplanned natural compaction and rapid manual intervention." She tapped that phrase into her report and asked me to confirm. I confirmed. That was the official story before the mud dried. After she left, Garth stood beside the truck tailgate with 2 paper cups of bad machine coffee and handed me one. "You want to tell me what you mean when you say you had help?" I watched steam lift off the cup and dissolve. Boone was sleeping under the bumper, worn out and content. "If I tell you exactly, you'll think I'm either lying or worn through." Garth took a sip, grimaced, then nodded. "I might. But I've worked with you 14 years. You don't spin stories." I looked toward the cedar line one more time. Big, dark, careful. Smarter than me about water in a crisis. Kept distance. Helped because the valley needed help. Then left. Garth didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He rubbed his thumb along the cup seam and stared at the wet shoulder. "My granddad used to say there are old things in these hills that mind their own business unless ours starts hurting everybody. I figured that was just old man weather talk." He gave me a sideways look. Maybe it wasn't. That was all he said, and all he ever said on it. He never revealed more, never asked for details again, never betrayed me in break room chatter. He just started volunteering for more dawn checks with me, and when we reached the west platform, he always took his cap off for 1 second, like a quiet courtesy to a co-worker not on payroll. By noon, the rain had broken and the spillway threw clean light. County crews installed additional stone and compacted clay across the whole weak section, then fenced off the area for a full rebuild the following week. During cleanup, I found the smooth capstone set slightly aside by the reinforcement work, still clean along one edge where that broad hand had pressed it. I held it in my palm, thumb fitting the same shallow curve I had watched him choose in the dark. Amber saw me with it and said, "Souvenir?" "Reference sample," I said. She smiled. "For unusual natural compaction?" "Something like that." I wrapped it in my spare flannel and put it behind the truck seat. Physical evidence accounted for, not for court, not for internet debates, just for memory and gratitude. At 1:30, my phone rang with Officer Mendez again. He said Wildlife Patrol had swept the upper trailheads and found 2 more inactive snare sites, both cleared, no active sets remaining near dam property. He thanked me for the earlier report and closed the file unless new evidence appeared. I told him that was good news, and meant it. One more loose thread tied down. After I hung up, I forwarded my snare photos and location notes from my county email into the official incident folder Amber had created that morning, then printed one hard copy for the maintenance binder. Nothing sat unresolved in drawers. I drove straight from Mill Creek to Bracken Valley High, with mud still on my cuffs. The front office clerk recognized me from old parent nights and pointed toward the shop wing. Through the open door, I heard grinders whining and teenagers arguing about measurement marks with that earnest certainty only teenagers have. Eli stood at a welding table, hood up, explaining bead spacing to a kid who kept crowding the line. He looked older than 30 in the jaw and younger in the eyes. When he saw me in the doorway, he paused, handed the stinger to his assistant teacher, and came outside into the hallway. "Dad," he said. "Not warm, not cold, guarded." "I won't keep you long," I said. "I should have called months ago. I didn't. That's on me." He crossed his arms, waiting. I took one breath and decided I was done with partial truths. We had a near failure at Mill Creek before dawn. West shoulder started piping. I called it in, opened gate 3, started handpack. I wasn't enough by myself. Something came out of the trees and helped me hold that seam until crew arrived. His expression didn't change, but he didn't walk away either. Something. "Yeah." He studied my face a long second, searching for performance and not finding it. "You telling me this as your son or as a witness statement?" "As my son first." My throat tightened again, but not like mourning, steadier now. "And because if I keep leaving the room while people are still in it, I'll die alone and call it professionalism." That got through. He blinked hard, looked down the hall, then back at me. "You really saw what you're saying." I did. Boone did too. And I know how that sounds. Eli let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "You always told me to trust tools and measurements." "I still do." He nodded slowly. "Then if you say this happened, I believe you believe it." He held up a hand before I could flinch at the wording. "No, hear me. I'm not mocking you. I think you saw something real. I just don't know what box to put it in yet." "Me neither." He uncrossed his arms. "You want coffee after school?" That simple offer hit like mercy. "Yeah, I do." We sat at Lila's at 4:15, the three of us at the back booth while Boone slept under the table like he owned the place. I told the full account once, from the first stone stack to the capstone at dawn. Eli asked practical questions, distances, angles, sequence, water levels. Lila asked human ones, how I felt when it looked at me, whether I had been afraid, why I thought it helped. I answered both kinds as plainly as I could. Neither of them treated me like a fool. Neither of them demanded proof beyond what I carried in my voice. When I finished, Lila reached over and tapped the table twice. "World's bigger than our categories," she said. "Sometimes kinder too." Eli looked at me across his coffee. "You calling me this week, or am I still running the scoreboard?" "I'm calling," I said. "Sunday evening, 6 o'clock. Do it twice and I'll believe your trend line." "Fair." By the second week of April, the county had completed the permanent West Shoulder rebuild, and Mill Creek moved into spring operations without further incident. I kept taking pre-dawn checks, but they weren't hiding places anymore. They were choices. Some mornings the birds went quiet near the cedar, and Boone, old as he was, would sit and wag at the trees for a minute before resuming his slow rounds. I never forced a sighting, never left bait, never turned reverence into a hunt. Once, after a hard rain, I found a line of fresh stones staged near a low washout by the service path, where a maintenance truck had been slipping. I used every one of them in the repair and said, "Thank you" out loud to empty timber. People in town settled on the official explanation because official explanations let life keep moving. Unusual natural compaction made the paper, and then disappeared under baseball scores and feed prices. A few old-timers gave me long looks at the hardware store, thoughtful rather than skeptical, but if they knew stories, they kept them. The only people who got my full truth were Eli and Lila. Garth got the shape of it and treated that shape with respect. Nobody else needed it from me. Sunday at 6, my phone rang and I answered on the second buzz. Eli and I talked 42 minutes about his students' projects, my shoulder rebuild specs, and a brisket recipe neither of us followed correctly. The next Sunday, we did it again. By June, we had a standing habit. Call on Sundays, in-person supper every other Thursday. No scorekeeping, no old courtroom. Just practice at being family on purpose. Now the smooth capstone sits on my porch rail above the river bend, right where evening light catches its pale edge. I pick it up some nights when the water is high and the old ache tries to come back, and the weight of it reminds me of that morning when pressure rose. Help arrived, and I was not left alone with what I couldn't hold. I still trust concrete, steel, and numbers. I still carry a wrench more comfortably than a confession. But I answer my phone. I show up. I apologize before silence hardens. Skepticism and wonder live side by side in me now, neither one cancelling the other, and that is the truest account I can give. Boone sleeps by the stove. Eli calls on Sundays. The valley stayed dry, and when dawn goes very still at Mill Creek, I tip my cap toward the cedar line and get on with the work.